The first thing Queen Varith noticed was not the silence. It was the absence of the smell of burning. Every morning in the Vethara reaches, the maintenance crews lit the atmospheric scrubbers at the outer ring of the colony dome. The combustion cycle produced a faint, acrid ghost, something between sulfur and hot copper, that drifted inward through the ventilation lattice and reached the Queen's chambers somewhere around the second hour of the waking cycle, threading through the recycled air like a reminder that the dome existed, because machines made it exist, and machines required maintenance, and maintenance required people. After 11 cycles of governing this moon, Varith had stopped consciously noticing it. The smell was simply part of waking, part of being here. The dome's morning breath. That morning it was gone. She stood at the tall window of her receiving chamber, her second set of arms folded across her chest in the posture her late consort had called the Queen thinking with her body, and she studied the dome's outer corridor. Empty. The maintenance crew should have been visible. She could see the outer ring walkway from this window on clear mornings, the orange shapes of biosuits moving methodically through their cleaning loop, hoses and scanners, and the soft blue of the scrubber ignition sequence. 6 workers. She knew each of their names because she had learned, early in her governorship, that you governed a dome better if you knew who kept it alive. The outer ring walkway was empty. The scrubbers were cold. She told herself there was an explanation. There always was. A rescheduled maintenance cycle, a reported systems issue, a piece of equipment that needed attention before the morning sequence. She had governed this moon for 11 cycles, and in 11 cycles there had always been an explanation, and the explanations had sometimes required significant effort to find, but they had always existed. She went to find one. The Vethara colony existed because humans had built it and then, through no fault of their own, lost it. That was the unofficial record, the one that Varith kept in her private archive. The official Keth Dominion record used considerably more careful language. It noted that humans had vacated the installation following the resolution, a phrase that accomplished the considerable diplomatic work of describing dispossession without naming it. The softer version, the one that circulated in the upper courts of the Dominion, where everyone had enough political experience to read between clean sentences, held that humans had not been optimally suited to the Vetharan environment, and had departed under the Dominion's careful guidance to settlements more appropriate to their biological and social requirements. The softest version of all, the one no official document used but that Varith had heard in meeting rooms and reception halls, and the kind of corridors where policy is really made, was that humans were simply not sophisticated enough for a moon this strategically valuable, and that the transfer had been mutually beneficial. Varith had read all 3 versions. She had also read the survey reports her predecessor had suppressed, the ones that noted the structural ingenuity of the colony dome's original construction, with a specificity that was embarrassing to the Dominion if you read carefully enough. The hydroponic systems that had kept 200 humans alive through a decade of volcanic disruption, adapted from equipment designed for a different moon's soil chemistry. The water reclamation network the original colonists had built from salvaged components when their supply shipment was delayed by 14 months, delayed because of a bureaucratic error in the Dominion Transit Authority, though the survey report noted this in the most diplomatic passive voice it could achieve. The power rerouting solution, implemented during the 4th cycle magnetic storm, improvised from components not designed for the purpose, documented on 6 handwritten pages in a notation system that Keth engineers had needed 3 weeks to decode after the handover. Those 6 pages, Varith had read them more than once. She had read them in the way she read things that deserved to be read slowly, with her full attention and her 4 hands flat on the desk, so that she could not fidget and had to simply absorb. Whoever had written them had understood the dome's power systems better than any Keth engineer who had subsequently worked in this facility. The annotation margin of the 3rd page was dense with secondary calculations, alternatives considered and discarded, failure modes anticipated and planned around, and the handwriting was small and precise and entirely unhurried, the handwriting of someone who had been working under significant stress, but had not allowed the stress to make their thinking imprecise. Verith did not know enough about individual humans to recognize a mind from its handwriting, but she had come, over many readings, to an impression. Careful, thorough, deeply uninterested in credit and deeply interested in solutions. She had always wondered who had written them. She pushed through the third connecting corridor now, past the administrative wing, past the sealed archive rooms whose pale gray doors she had passed 1,000 times without opening, toward the outer maintenance ring. Her steps clicked on the smooth floor. Normally the corridors at this hour would have a low hum of ambient life, ventilation, distant conversations, the soft machinery of a dome going about its morning. The ambient hum was gone. Her steps produced echoes that came back to her too cleanly, with nothing to diffuse them. The dome housed 412 Keth citizens. It also housed, as of 6 months ago, one human. The human had arrived with no fanfare and very little documentation, which was itself notable, because the Keth Dominion's administrative apparatus produced documentation the way a wound produced inflammation, reflexively, extensively, and usually in a quantity inverse to its usefulness. A transit permit, single page. A research affiliation code linked to the lower thermal vent station. And a sponsor authorization that, when Verith's administrative aide traced it back through the system, resolved to Verith's own daughter. Sereth had not mentioned it. The human's name, rendered phonetically in Keth script, was Kale. No clan identifier. No home colony registered, only a coordinate set that Verith's aide had spent 2 days cross-referencing before concluding that the coordinates corresponded to a human settlement on a moon 2 transit gates away that had been abandoned approximately 9 years ago following an industrial collapse. No surviving administrative records from the settlement. No family contacts listed. A blank space in the file where the origin documentation should have been, and a single line noting that the information was unavailable for administrative reasons, which was the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug. Verith had flagged the file with an intent-to-follow-up notation. She had done this on a day when the lower volcanic shelf had produced 3 separate seismic events in 6 hours, and 2 of her trade faction representatives were engaged in a dispute that threatened to close the eastern transit lanes, and the school system's infrastructure committee was demanding emergency funding, and her daughter was not returning her calls from the vent station, because Sereth only stopped returning calls when she was either very deep in her research or very deliberately avoiding conversation she wasn't ready to have. She had not followed up. She was thinking about this now, moving through the silent corridor toward the maintenance ring, as she had been thinking about it intermittently for 6 months. The particular flavor of thought that is not quite guilt and not quite regret, but is the feeling of having meant to do something and having had it remain undone. She had governed a moon for 11 cycles. She had learned that some things stayed undone because they could not be done, and some stayed undone because the doing of them was dangerous, and some stayed undone simply because a day is a finite thing, and a moon requires an enormous amount of doing. She pushed through the door to the outer maintenance ring. The room was empty in a way that was different from the emptiness of a room whose occupants are elsewhere. Tools hung on their racks in exact position, the position people return tools to when they care about their work and intend to use them again. The day's work order was posted on the scheduling board in its sealed morning casing, the seal unbroken, meaning no one had yet signed in for the day's work. 6 orange biosuits hung on their hooks, their clean fabric collapsed in the specific shape of garments waiting for bodies. One hook was empty. Verith stood and looked at the empty hook for a long moment, noting the exact position of it, 3rd row, leftmost position, the hook assigned to the crew's lead technician, A woman named Sarath, who had been maintaining the outer ring scrubbers for 7 years, and who had, the previous week, brought Verith a handwritten report about a microfracture in the dome's secondary lattice that she'd found during routine inspection, and documented with more care than most of Verith's administrative staff brought to official proceedings. She went to find her security chief. Her security chief was also missing. She found the first vanished citizen 20 minutes later, or rather, she found the evidence of a citizen who was no longer where they had been. The sleeping quarters of a junior administrator named Porvith. His morning meal was on the desk in the casual arrangement of interrupted eating, a partial bowl, a spoon set down not cleaned but not abandoned, as if the hand that set it down fully intended to pick it up again. His communication panel was active, screen lit, mid-message in composition. The recipient field showed his daughter's ID code, registered to the 4th moon of the inner system. The message text in the composition window was 7 words long. "I have been meaning to tell you." Verith stood in the doorway and looked at the 7 words for a longer time than she had intended. She was not a sentimental person. 11 years of governing a moon with 3 active fault lines and 4 competing administrative factions, and a budget that never balanced and a population whose needs were varied and immediate and ongoing had left her with a practical relationship to sentiment. She did not suppress it. She had simply learned to process it quickly and move. She processed this. She looked at the 7 words. She noted the meal and the spoon and the active screen, and all the small surrounding details that described a person who had been here and was not here any longer. She turned and walked very quickly back to the main corridor. She could feel it now, what she had been not quite noticing since she woke. The silence was not an absence of sound but a subtraction of it. The dome's ambient life, ventilation cycling, the distant metallic sounds of the civic systems doing their work, the low collective noise of 400 people existing in a shared space, was diminished. Not gone, diminished, like a piece of music missing some of its instruments. She walked and listened and counted what she could still hear and what she could not, and she began to understand the shape of what was wrong before she had any framework to name it. She went to the communications hub. The array was operational, all status lights green, all systems functioning, but the live operator station was empty. The duty log showed the previous operator's sign-off at the end of the previous cycle and no sign-in since. She sat at the operator station and tried the emergency channel. It opened. She heard the carrier signal. Nothing responded. She tried the administrative relay. Silence. She tried the security office. Silence. She tried 3 more channels, working inward from the outer ring, and each time the channel opened and no one answered. She had a growing sense that she was calling into rooms that had recently been full of people and were now full of nothing but the equipment those people had been using. She tried the channel reserved for the lower thermal vent research station. The channel opened and a voice said, "I know." She had never heard this voice before, and she knew immediately whose it was. "I've been watching it happen since the 3rd hour," Kale said. "I've been trying to reach anyone. You're the first one who's answered." Verith had met Kale only once. Sarath had introduced them 3 months ago in the passage outside the research wing's primary lab, an introduction that had possessed the deliberate casualness of something that had been rehearsed, in the way that Sarath rehearsed things she cared about while maintaining the appearance of not caring. "Mother, this is Kale. He's been helping with the vent analysis." A slight pause after analysis that Verith had noted and filed away. Then Sarath had found something urgent to attend to elsewhere, leaving the 2 of them in the passage with the efficient abandon that Verith also recognized as her daughter's work. He had been shorter than she'd expected. She'd had no reason to expect anything. She had met perhaps a dozen humans in her public life, in diplomatic contexts where their physical presentations were formal, but she had held some image and the image was slightly different from the reality. He had a dark, composed face and a particular quality of stillness that she did not immediately have a framework for. Most people in her presence moved. Politicians arranged themselves. Scientists fidgeted with data they were thinking about. Security staff maintained the careful stillness of vigilance. This was different. It was the stillness of someone who had learned, in some context she couldn't read, that drawing attention unnecessarily was a thing to avoid. The stillness of a person who had spent significant time being the only one of their kind in a room and had calibrated their presence accordingly. Not hiding, exactly, but occupying exactly as much space as the situation required and no more. He had inclined his head. She had learned later that this was a gesture of respect in his cultural context. She had not known it then and had read it as simply a thing he did. She had nodded back, which was the Keth equivalent, and said she hoped the research was going well, and he had said it was, and Sareth had returned from her urgent errand looking slightly too composed, and the moment had passed. She had thought about it intermittently since. She was not sure why. Now his voice came through the communications array, and she held very still. "Tell me what you know," she said. "Start from the beginning." "Third hour," he said, in the measured pace of someone who has already organized the information before being asked for it. One of the junior researchers, a person named Thurva, assigned to the Eastern Relay Check, didn't come back from the surface crawl. We waited. Assumed equipment issue, communication delay. Fourth hour, 2 more didn't come back. Fifth hour, Sareth and I climbed to the relay station on the surface tier and found the station unmanned. All equipment operational. All logs running. The log timestamps show exactly when each researcher arrived at the station and exactly when their signal ended. No distress indicator. No biological variance in the biometric feed. The feed just stops. Mid-signal. Like an interference cut, Verith said. Like a person simply no longer being there to produce the signal, he said. We've tested every piece of equipment we have access to. Nothing is malfunctioning. The signal isn't being blocked. The person who was generating the signal is gone. Verith thought about Porvith's meal. The spoon set down with the intention of picking it up again. "Where is Sarath?" she said. Her voice came out as she had trained it, level clear, a queen's voice in a moment of crisis. It gave nothing away. That was its purpose. "Here," he said, "with me. We're in the lower vent station. We sealed the access after the 5th disappearance in the 6th hour, and we haven't opened it since." A pause. "She's well. She's scared, but she's working, which is what she does when she's scared." Verith felt something in her chest that was not a Keth word, but was a sensation she recognized from 20 years of being a mother, which was this: relief and fear arriving simultaneously and occupying exactly the same space, so that you could not separate them and simply had to carry both at once. "What do you know?" she said. "Not what you suspect, not what you fear, only what you have observed and can verify." She heard him breathe. She heard him organize. "The disappearances began at the outermost perimeter of the dome," he said, "and have been moving inward. The pattern is consistent, outer ring first, then middle rings, progressively inward. The rate is not constant. In the 3rd and 4th hours, approximately 1 disappearance every 40 to 50 minutes. The rate is accelerating. Based on the biometric log gaps I've been tracking, we're currently at approximately 1 every 9 minutes. He paused. "The dome has 412 registered occupants. I've been keeping count." Verith did not ask how many were left. She would ask later. "What else?" she said. "The original human colonists of this dome documented something similar," he said. The words sat in the channel between them. Verith's second arms, folded across her chest, tightened slightly. "Explain," she said. "In the 9th year of the original human occupation," Kale said. "The colony engineer documented a series of disappearances with the same pattern, perimeter first, moving inward, accelerating rate. The phenomenon stopped after approximately 3 months." He paused. "The colony was relocated by the Dominion about 3 months after the phenomenon stopped. The documentation of the disappearances is in the physical archive here in the dome. Level C, East Wing, Room 7. Sareth found the records 18 months ago, while doing background research on the dome's environmental history. Verith was quiet for a moment. Why wasn't this reported? A pause on the other end. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of someone selecting words with care, not to deceive but to be accurate. The original human colony is a sensitive political matter in current Dominion history. We were completing the cross-referencing before filing a formal report. We wanted the documentation to be thorough before we brought it forward. Another pause. We were also aware that reporting it might draw attention to the fact that the archive exists and its contents had not been part of the official handover documentation. Because the survey data that included the original human engineering records was suppressed by the Dominion administration, Verith said. A silence that said, "Yes, and you know this, and we both know why neither of us named it directly until now." "Yes," he said. "The archive documentation," Verith said. "What does it tell you about what stopped the disappearances?" "That's what I need 4 minutes to determine," he said. "I have an idea. I need to test the calculation before I present it to you. A beat. Can you stay where you are for 4 minutes?" Verith looked around the communications hub, the operator station, the empty duty log, the green status lights telling her that all systems were functioning and all channels were open and no one was answering. 4 minutes, she said. In the lower vent station, Cale Marin set his communication unit to standby and spread the engineering schematic across the floor, because the only flat surface large enough for it was the floor. The schematic was a copy. He'd photographed the original from the archive 18 months ago on the second day. Sareth had shown him the room, when they were still being careful with each other, and she was explaining the research with the slightly more formal than necessary precision she used when she was uncertain how much to reveal. He'd looked at the 6 handwritten pages of the power rerouting documentation and asked if he could photograph them, and she'd said yes, and he had, very carefully, every page including the margin annotations, because the margin annotations were where the person who wrote them had been thinking out loud, and that was the part that mattered most. He had spent a significant amount of time since then thinking about those pages. He was thinking about them now with one part of his mind, while another part ran the resonance calculations he'd been building for the past 2 hours, since the third disappearance, when he'd stopped waiting for the situation to resolve itself and started working the problem. He had been afraid for approximately 3.5 hours. This was longer than he usually spent being afraid before the fear organized itself into something usable. He thought the length reflected the specific quality of this fear, not the fear of identifiable threat, of a thing that could be fought or outrun or negotiated with, but the fear of an unknown process that removed people from existence without warning or trace or apparent logic. That fear was harder to organize because there was nothing to push against. There was only the absence of the people who had been there, and the biometric logs going flat, and the accelerating count. He had organized it eventually. He had set it in the particular compartment he kept for fears that were real and ongoing, and could not be eliminated, only acknowledged and worked around, and he had gone back to the calculations. He was good at this. He had learned it not from formal training, but from the years after his home settlement's industrial collapse, when the emergency response had been slow and inadequate in the way that emergency responses to small human settlements in remote Keth-administered territories tended to be. And there had been a winter that needed surviving, and a community that needed organizing and resources that needed to be found and managed and distributed, and no one who was going to do that if he didn't. He had been 22. He had learned, over that winter and the ones that followed, that fear was real and reasonable, and that it occupied a specific amount of space in the mind, and that the mind had other space, and that the thing to do was to put the fear in its space and work in the rest. He worked. Sarath sat against the wall across from him, watching. She had her secondary arms folded in the posture that he knew meant she was doing her own calculations, the ones she ran internally, the ones she almost never showed unless she was certain, because Sarath's version of intellectual caution was to wait until she had certainty before she spoke. He had come to love this about her. He had come to love a number of things about her over 18 months of working together, which was not. He was clear-eyed about this. What either of them had intended when she'd first brought him in as an assistant researcher on a 3-month contract that had extended again, and then simply stopped being counted. "You're working the power core resonance," she said. The original colony engineer documented the rerouting solution creating a standing electromagnetic oscillation in the dome's structural lattice, he said. A specific frequency. When the oscillation was active, the disappearances stopped. When it wasn't active before the rerouting, and potentially after it decayed, the disappearances occurred. Sarath was quiet for a moment. The engineer attributed the cessation to coincidence. The engineer attributed it to a resonance interaction between the rerouting and the dome's structural lattice, he said. She wasn't sure it caused the cessation. She documented it as a potential correlation, and then the colony was relocated before she could confirm. He traced the schematic with his finger. "I've been running the frequency analysis for the past 2 hours. The dome's current power core runs on the same base architecture as the original. The surface systems were updated by your engineers during the takeover, but the structural lattice is original. The frequency is still achievable." "If you're right about the correlation," Sarath said, "if it was the frequency that stopped the disappearances." "If," he said, "but I am asking you to consider, 200 humans survived whatever this is by living in a dome that accidentally produced this frequency. For 3 months. And then the frequency was no longer sustained, and 3 months later the colony was relocated. And nobody ever asked why the disappearances stopped. The survey documentation that would have told anyone to ask why was suppressed." He looked up at her. "We have the same architecture. We can produce the same frequency. If I'm right, it works. If I'm wrong, we've wasted 11 seconds and learned something." A pause. "I would like to try." Sarath looked at him for a long moment in the focused way she had, the lens way, giving him her whole attention. He held it. "My mother," she said finally, "will need to access the main power distribution junction at the central hub to activate the primary rerouting cascade. The override codes are at her authorization level." "Yes," he said. "The central hub is 2 corridors beyond the current boundary of the disappearances," she said. "Yes," he said. A silence. He looked back at the schematic. She didn't move. "She'll do it," Sarath said, "not a question." "I know," he said. "That's not what I'm worried about." "She'll be angry with me for not reporting the archive earlier," Sarath said. "Probably," he said. "That's not what I'm worried about either." "Then what?" He looked at the biometric monitor on the station's secondary panel. Another flat line had appeared while they were talking. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up the communication unit and opened the channel back to the Queen. "I'm ready," he said. "I'm going to explain it as fast as I can." He transmitted the schematic and the calculation summary, and explained the theory in the 4 minutes he'd asked for, which proved to be almost exactly sufficient because Verith read technical documentation with a speed that suggested she had, at some point in her life, read very large amounts of it in very compressed time frames. She was silent through most of the explanation. When he finished, she did not ask the question he'd expected, "Is this certain?" Because she had understood from the explanation that it could not be certain. She asked the questions that mattered. How would the secondary pulse work? What was the exact sequence? What was the timing parameter and why? He walked her through it, and she had follow-up questions that told him she was reading the schematic simultaneously, cross-referencing in real time. The questions were precise and asked nothing he couldn't answer. He answered them. Then she said, "The central hub is 2 corridors inside the current disappearance boundary." "Yes," he said. "At the current rate of 1 disappearance every 9 minutes, she said, "and the time required to reach the hub, approximately 7 minutes of transit, I will be within the active zone for the duration of the approach and the activation." "Yes," he said. She did not respond immediately. He listened to the silence on the channel and did not fill it, because it was the silence of a person working through something that needed to be worked through, and filling it would have been wrong. Then she said, "There is something I want you to know before I go." He listened. She told him about the file, about the sponsor authorization that led back to Sarath, about the 6 months of flagged and unfollowed-up notation, about reading the suppressed survey reports and the 6 handwritten pages of the power rerouting documentation more than once, and the impression she had formed from them: careful, thorough, deeply uninterested in credit and deeply interested in solutions, and not having known whose impression it was until now. "I should have followed up 6 months ago," she said. "I should have asked Sarath directly. I should have read the archive documentation when it was reported to exist rather than letting it sit in a flag. I am telling you this not as an apology, but as an account of what is true." A pause. "I am also telling you that I do not allow political convenience to determine what is documented and what is suppressed. What is in that archive will be restored to the official record when this is over, regardless of what it reflects on my administration or my predecessors." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "You know," she said. "Sarath has talked about you," he said, "for 18 months, not frequently, not elaborately, but enough." The silence on the channel had a quality he could not quite read, which was unusual because he had, in 18 months of talking with Sarath about her mother, developed some ability to interpret Varith from a distance. "My daughter values you," Varith said. "I became aware of this approximately 8 months ago and have been managing what that means since then. I am telling you this because if I walk 2 corridors past a boundary that is currently consuming my people at a rate of 1 every 9 minutes, I would like there to be a record of that. I am aware of it, as a fact, as something I have processed." Another pause. "In a qualified way." "A qualified way," he said. "You are human," she said. "I have not determined what that means for me. I am in the process of determining it. A beat. Get my daughter home." "Yes," he said. The channel went to standby. He sat for a moment on the floor with the schematic across his knees. Sarath said from the wall quietly, "She called you Kale." "Yes," he said. "She never uses first names," Sarath said, "for people she has not decided to trust." He looked at the schematic. He looked at the biometric monitor. "Then we shouldn't let her down," he said. He picked up the secondary pulse controls and began his calibration sequence. Varith moved through her dome the way she had always governed it, with the efficiency of someone who has decided a thing is necessary and is no longer spending any energy on whether it ought to be necessary. She had 11 years of practice at this. It was the skill she was most grateful for and most ambivalent about in equal measure, because the decisions that benefited from it were not always the decisions that deserved to be made quickly. She passed the archive room. She stopped. Room 7, East Wing, Level C. The door was pale gray, unremarkable, identical to the doors of the other archive rooms except for the number plate. She had passed it more times than she could count and never opened it. She pressed her hand to the door panel. It opened, not locked, never locked, simply never opened. Inside, small room, cool, amber emergency light, shelves in protective film, everything preserved with the care of things that were meant to be accessible. She found the documents on the second shelf, third section, behind a cross-reference marker that said * Original Colony Engineering Records, Human Settlement, Years 110. The physical sheets were in protective sleeves. She took the last file, Year 9, and pulled it open. The handwriting was immediately familiar. She had spent enough time with the photographed copies, the 6 pages of rerouting documentation, to know it. The same small, precise, unhurried hand. The same habit of margin annotation. The same quality of someone who had not been writing for an audience but for the record, which is a different thing and almost always produces better writing. She read the last page. The engineer had written. She was reading a translation, rough in places, the old human trade dialect rendering into Keth imprecisely, something like, "I still don't have an explanation for what it is. I've described what I observed. I've documented the cessation and my best theory for why it occurred. I don't know if the theory is right. I don't know if the cessation would have been permanent or if it would have started again, and the relocation simply moved us before it could. I don't know what happens to the people who disappear. These are the things I know I don't know. The things I don't know that I don't know are probably more numerous." And then at the bottom of the page, in the same careful handwriting, "If whoever comes after us finds this documentation and ever needs it, the rerouting solution is in the Year 4 technical file. The frequency parameter is on page 3. Hold for 11 seconds exactly. Not more. I don't know what more does, but in the initial test it produced an inverse effect that I didn't like the look of. 11 seconds exactly. I hope you find this when you need it and not before." Verith stood in the archive room with the page in her hand. She thought a woman who knew she was leaving documented everything she'd learned for whoever came after her. In a room that was then sealed away by an administration that found the existence of the documentation inconvenient. And it sat here for 70 years. And 2 researchers found it 18 months ago and were careful with it and were waiting for the right time. There were no right times. There was only the time you had. She put the document back very carefully. She ran. First corridor past the administrative wing. The pressure arrived immediately, not external, not a thing she could point to or name with any Keth word she had, but a sensation of something testing the edges of herself, probing where she stopped and the surrounding air began. She had no framework for it. She ran through it. Second corridor. It intensified. The sensation had a quality like the feeling in her secondary arms during a high-voltage electromagnetic event. A hum that was not a sound but was felt in the tissues, at the places where organic material met the physics of the world. She had stood in the administrative court on the day the 3rd volcanic uplift event occurred, and felt the ground become uncertain beneath her feet, and had continued the proceedings because what else was there to do? She ran. The central hub door was at the end of the second corridor. She reached it and pressed her hand to the panel and keyed her authorization. The panel cycled. The door opened. She went in. "I'm at the junction," she said. Kale's voice. "Secondary array is calibrated. Sarath has confirmed the pulse synchronization." A pause, careful. "Are you reading the distribution panel?" Yes. She was already at the panel, the schematic on her communication unit screen beside her, the original notation and the current system overlay together. The translation between them was not straightforward. The original engineer had used a notation system developed for a different generation of power architecture, and the conversion to current Keth engineering notation required a step that was not documented anywhere official, and that Kale had noted in his summary with the dry precision of someone who has encountered bureaucratic obstruction and has found a way around it rather than through it. She worked the conversion. It took 3 minutes. The conversion was correct. "The override sequence," Kale said. "When you activate it, it cascades through all 6 distribution nodes in sequence. The cascade completes at approximately the 9-second mark. The frequency builds to its full parameter at the 11-second mark. You hold through the full 11 seconds and then release." "And exactly at 11, she said. "Exactly," he said. "The original documentation is specific." She wrote at the bottom of her final report, Verith said, that she hoped whoever found the documentation found it when they needed it. A pause. So did we, Kale said. She had her hand on the override key. The distribution panel displayed the status of all 6 nodes, green and steady, waiting. She thought about Porvith's 7 words. She thought about Sarath and the careful report about the dome's structural microfracture, written with more precision than most official documents she received. She thought about 412 names, and the count that had been running since the 3rd hour, and the biometric logs going flat one by one. She thought about Alara Voss, whose name she didn't have yet but would, before the day was out, writing in the margin of her 3rd page. Alternatives considered and discarded, failure modes anticipated and planned around, in handwriting that was unhurried, in a moment that cannot have been unhurried, simply because she had trained herself to think clearly when clarity was what the situation needed. Ready, Vareth said. On your mark, Kale said. She counted. She did not count aloud. She had learned not to count aloud in moments of high consequence, because the act of speaking pulled attention from the act of doing, and both required her full self. She counted internally, the Keth number progression that she had learned as a child, that she had used to count the years of her governorship, that she used to count the days between communications from Sarath when Sarath went quiet because she was deep in research or deep in a feeling she wasn't ready to name. At 3, she pressed the key. The dome breathed. That was the only word for it later, when she wrote the account. The dome breathed, a systemic shudder that moved through the structure from the distribution nodes outward, through the lattice that was 70 years old and had been built by people who were no longer here, carrying a frequency they had discovered and documented and trusted to whoever came after. The lights went uncertain, cycling between their states like something thinking. The ventilation caught and released. The fountains in the plaza outside the hub's window stopped. The mechanical breath of 400 systems faltered. She held. The pressure that had followed her from the outer corridors, that inside-out probing of her own edges, intensified with sudden abruptness, went sharp in a way she had no language for. She held. She thought, the tide is indifferent. She had read those words in Alara Voss's final report, not in those exact words, but in that understanding. A tide does not hate what it drowns. It is a process. It does not recognize resistance. It simply continues. And continuing is also something she knew how to do. 5-6. Hold, said Kale's voice in the channel, quiet as something steady. 7-8. The sharpness peaked. She thought, 11 cycles of governing a moon requires knowing when the only available action is to continue. She held. 9, 10, 11. She released the key. The dome was silent for 3 full seconds. Then the ventilation started. A single smooth cycle, clean and certain. The lights steadied to their normal parameters, one by one, in the sequence she had watched every morning of 11 cycles. The fountains in the plaza began to run, and through the ventilation, threading inward through the lattice in the way that had always threaded its way to her sleeping chamber, and that she had never again in her life wanted to take for granted. The smell of burning, sulfur and hot copper, the atmospheric scrubbers igniting in the outer ring, their combustion cycle beginning, the dome's morning breath restored. She stood at the distribution panel and let out a breath of her own. Sarath, she said. Secondary pulse complete. Her daughter's voice, in the careful tone she used when she was keeping herself together over something she was not ready to feel fully yet. All readings nominal. The frequency is in the lattice. Kale. Holding, he said. Stable, a pause, Your Highness. The biometric grid. She looked at the secondary screen. The biometric life sign array for the dome. In the hours since she'd woken, it had been diminishing, a chart of losses, each flat line a name she would go on to learn and hold. Now the remaining signs were unchanged but stable, and around them, slowly, with the uncertain quality of something not quite certain of its own reality, new signs were appearing. Faint, fluctuating, but present. "What is this?" she said. "I don't know," Cale said. "The original documentation." "Didn't mention recoveries," she said. "No," he said, "new data." She stood and watched the grid and counted what was returning. Slow and uncertain, like sleepers waking from something too deep to surface from quickly. Present. Real. Not all of them. She could see that immediately. The count that was building was not the count that had been lost, but some of them, coming back from wherever the process had taken them. "We document it," she said. "Everything that's happening on this grid, every variance, every timestamp. We document it exactly as Alara Voss documented what she knew. We leave a record that is precise and findable and assumes nothing about who will need it or what they'll know." A pause. "Are you already recording?" "Have been since the 3rd hour," Cale said. She looked at the grid. She thought, 61 years between the engineer's report and the moment her documentation saved 400 people. 70 years of a document sitting in a room that no one opened. She thought, the time between writing something down and someone needing it is unpredictable and often long, and the only protection against it is to write it down carefully and make sure it can be found. "I'm coming to you," she said. She found them in the vent station an hour later, having stopped at the communications hub to file an emergency status report, patch the external relay back online, and begin the coordination with the response teams at the outer relay stations. The coordination would take 12 hours to complete. She did the first hour of it before she went, because it needed doing and she was the one who knew how to do it, and because she had learned that in crises the instinct to go immediately to the people you love can sometimes be an indulgence that costs the people you are responsible for. She had also stopped, briefly, at the archive room. The vent station was lit with amber emergency lights and the soft blue of monitoring equipment. Sarath was at the control array, running lattice integrity checks with the focused concentration she brought to work that mattered. Cale was on the floor with the schematic, the same position she imagined he'd been in for most of the past several hours, and he looked up when she came in. She took in the picture of them, her daughter, this human, the hours of work they'd done in this station with the access sealed, and the count running on the biometric grid, and she composed her face in the way she had learned to compose it, professionally and with practice, and held the composition. 41 recoveries as of my last reading, she said, growing. Sarath put down her scanner and said, carefully, good. 61 still unaccounted for, Vareth said. The response teams are coordinating from the outer relay stations. We'll have full assessment by morning cycle. She looked at the lattice integrity display. The frequency is stable. Stable, Cale said. He was still on the floor. She looked at him for a moment, straightforwardly, as she had not done in the 3 months since their meeting, tired in the specific way of someone who has been managing fear for a long time and has only now been able to set most of it down. Not all of it. Some fears don't set down until the thing they were about is fully resolved, and this thing was not fully resolved. But some. Stand up, she said. He stood. He was shorter than she'd expected, still. She had spent the past 7 hours communicating with him across a crisis that had required precise technical information transmitted quickly and clearly and used correctly, and she had not once doubted the accuracy of what he was sending. That was an unusual experience. She registered it. The archive, she said. Everything in room 7, East Wing, level C. I want it cataloged in full, original documents, photographs, cross-references, translation annotations. I want it integrated into the dome's active engineering record, not the historical archive, cross-referenced with the current power systems documentation. She paused. In the original human engineering notation, alongside the Keth standard, both notations clearly labeled. I want any engineer who works on this dome in the next 100 years to be able to read it. "I can do that," he said. "The suppressed survey data," she said, "will be formally restored to the official Dominion archive. I will be making that filing myself. It will list you and Sarath as the researchers who located and preserved the archive documentation." She paused. "That is not optional." He looked at her, she looked at him. "You wrote a report 3 months ago," he said, "documenting a microfracture in the dome's secondary lattice. You sent it to the Infrastructure Committee, and it was filed under routine maintenance." Vareth was still for a moment. "That was Sarath's report," she said, "my senior maintenance technician." "Yes," he said, "but you knew about it, and you followed up on the committee's response." He paused. Sarath mentioned it, in the context of explaining what kind of person her mother was. Vareth looked at her daughter. Sarath was studying the lattice display with extreme concentration. "What did she say?" Vareth said. "That you were the kind of person who reads things that have been filed and forgotten, and then quietly makes sure they're not forgotten," he said. "And that this was not a common quality among people with the amount of power you have." The amber light in the vent station was warm and indirect. Vareth's second arms adjusted their position, not to the queen thinking with her body posture, but to something more resting, a posture she rarely occupied outside her private chambers. She was aware of this. She left the adjustment where it was. "The original engineer," she said, "Ilara Voss." Something shifted in Kale's expression. "You found her name." "The transit records from the original colony registry," Vareth said. "I stopped at the archive on the way here. I found the notation in the colony administrative file, the one that should have been part of the formal handover but was somehow omitted. She let the somehow carry what it needed to carry. I am adding her name to the dome's engineering record. Formal citation, first position. I would like you to verify the complete name and credentials from the registry documentation when we catalog the archive." Kale looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I'll do that today." "Good," Vareth said. She looked at the biometric grid. 46 signs now, returning slowly. She looked at the count of the ones that had not returned, that she would spend months investigating and years trying to understand. And she carried that count in the same place she carried the count of every responsibility she had ever assumed. Present, not crushing, simply carried. She looked at her daughter, who had stopped pretending to study the lattice display, and was looking at her with the expression Vareth recognized from Sarath's childhood, and from every subsequent moment when her daughter had been afraid that something would not be all right, and had discovered that it might be after all. Vareth crossed the station and stood next to her. She put one of her primary hands on Sarath's secondary arm, briefly, which was the Keth gesture that did not have an exact translation but meant roughly, "I am here and you are here, and that is enough for now." Sarath took a breath. 46, she said, reading the grid. "Growing," Vareth said. By the time the emergency response teams arrived from the outer relay stations 14 hours later, the recovery count had reached 48 and held. 48 people back. 61 whose names Vareth had in a separate list, which she kept on her personal communication unit and looked at regularly, because she had found over 11 years of governing a moon that the things you do not look at do not go away, they simply accumulate in the dark. She preferred to look. The report she filed was 37 pages. She wrote it through the night in the vent station, because the vent station's equipment was the best place to monitor the ongoing lattice stability, and she had work to do there regardless. Kale cross-referenced timestamps and ran biometric verification calculations, while Sarath maintained the frequency monitoring and fielded external communications. Around the 5th hour, he brought her a corrected derivation for the oscillation decay rate and stood at her workstation to show her the adjustment. And she read it and said, "Show me the method," and he showed her. And she said, "Your notation is more efficient than the standard," and did not wait for acknowledgement before incorporating it into the report. At the 6th hour, Sarath brought food to both of them without being asked. stood next to Kale in the way that was not incidental, and did not look at her mother while doing it. Vareth 8, she noted the standing and the not looking. She returned to the report. The report included a full account of the crisis and response, organized in precise chronological order with biometric data appended, a technical summary of the resonance frequency activation and the evidence base for its efficacy, a formal citation of the original human engineering documentation with Alara Voss listed in full, a recommendation for the restoration of all suppressed survey data to the official Dominion archive, a second recommendation for a formal historical review of the political decisions that had resulted in its suppression, a third recommendation, which she expected would produce the most significant institutional resistance, and which she filed without hesitation, that the dome's current engineering documentation be updated to include the original human notation system, alongside current Keth standard, on the grounds that the original system had, in a documented crisis, been the one that mattered. She did not note in the report that it had been a human who had found the solution. She noted it in the cover filing, in the acknowledgments section, in the formal citation, and in the official restoration request, all of which were public-facing documents. She had learned, over 11 years, that the official record was only as complete as the people who filed it made it, and that the filling in of convenient gaps in official records was an act that compounded over time into a distorted account of the world, and that she was not willing to contribute to that distortion regardless of what it cost her. She wrote the acknowledgement section last, when the vent station had gone quiet and the equipment was cycling through its monitoring checks in a low, even rhythm. Kale was working on the archive catalog at the secondary station. She looked at the acknowledgement section and added a line that was not standard official language. The first record of this phenomenon was made by engineer Alara Voss of the Vethara human settlement in the 9th year of their occupation. Her documentation was thorough, precise, and correctly anticipated its own future utility. She ended her final entry with the hope that whoever came after her would find her record when they needed it. This report is confirmation that they did. She saved the document. Outside, through the vent station's single high window, the dome's lights were steady in their morning cycle. The recovery count on the biometric grid had held at 48 for the past 6 hours, not growing, but not diminishing. Stable. The lattice frequency was holding. The atmospheric scrubbers were burning in the outer ring, their combustion producing the faint, acrid ghost that came through the ventilation and reached her where she sat. She breathed it in. She sat with it for a moment, the ordinary smell of a dome doing its ordinary work, with the slight additional knowledge that she would carry going forward, added to the knowledge she already carried, of exactly what it meant for that smell to be there. Then she picked up her stylus and went back to work. There is a particular quality to the hour just before a dome's morning maintenance cycle begins. The last 10 minutes before the outer ring crews sign in, before the scrubbers ignite, before the ambient noise of a working population rises to its ordinary level. A quality of waiting that is not quite silence and not quite anticipation, but is something between, the dome holding itself, as a held breath holds. Vareth had always woken in that hour, for 11 cycles. She had taken it, privately, as her time. The hour when there were no administrative demands and no scheduled proceedings and no communications that could not wait 10 minutes. She would stand at her window and look out at the outer corridor and watch the maintenance crew move through their morning loop, the orange shapes of their biosuits, the soft blue of the scrubber ignition, and think about whatever needed thinking without the requirement to act on it yet. She stood at her window now, 37 days after the crisis, and watched Sereth's crew move through the outer ring. 6 orange biosuits, 5 of them familiar from before and 1 new, the replacement for Thurva, whose name was on Vareth's list, whose biometric signal had been one of the 61 that had not returned. The new crew member moved with slightly less ease than the others, still learning the particular rhythm of the outer ring's morning loop. By next cycle, they would have it. These things were learned. The report had generated, as anticipated, significant institutional resistance. The third recommendation, regarding the dual notation engineering documentation, had produced the most, which she had also anticipated. She had responded to each objection individually, with specific supporting evidence from the crisis documentation, and had then filed a revised version of the recommendation with additional evidentiary appendices. The revised version had generated a different kind of resistance, quieter, less formally organized, the kind that worked through unofficial channels rather than official ones. She was tracking those channels. She had been tracking unofficial resistance channels for 11 cycles. She was better at it than most people wanted her to be. The archive restoration had been completed. Ilara Voss's full name and credentials were now in the dome's formal engineering record, first citation, with a notation explaining the circumstances of the suppression and restoration. Verith had written the notation herself, in language that was careful and accurate, and did not leave anything ambiguous that should not be ambiguous. She had expected the restoration to generate objections. It had generated fewer than she'd expected. She was not certain whether this reflected a change in the political landscape or simply that the objectors were choosing their battles, but she had filed the record regardless, and it was now public and could not be unfiled. She found this satisfying in the way of things accomplished that could not be undone. The frequency was still holding in the lattice. Kale had run verification checks every 3 days, and the oscillation was decaying more slowly than the original documentation had predicted, which he'd noted in a supplementary report with careful attention to what they did and didn't know about why. He'd also found, in the cross-referencing of the original survey data now restored to the official archive, 2 additional references to the phenomenon from the original colony records, brief mentions in the administrative logs of the 3rd and 6th years, before the 9th-year crisis, describing unusual disappearances that had resolved without explanation. He'd brought this to Verith's attention in person, which meant he had come to the administrative wing, which he had never done before the crisis, and stood at her office door and said, "I found something." She had told him to come in. He had come in and presented the supplementary findings, and she had read them and said, "This has been happening longer than the 9th year." And he had said yes. And she had said, which means the original colonists may have been surviving it for their entire occupation, not just the last 3 months. And he had said, "That's my current assessment," and she had said, "Document it." And he had said, "It's already in the supplementary report." Pages 6 through 9. And she had looked at him and said nothing for a moment and then said, "I know. I wanted to see if you'd say it." He had almost smiled. She had noted the almost. Sarath had told her in the 43rd day after the crisis, in the direct way Sarath had when she decided to say a thing, and had been deciding for long enough that the decision was finished. "He's not staying because of the research." A pause. "I want you to know that I know the difference." Verith had said, "I know you do." Sarath had said, "And I want you to know that the research is also real. It's not a cover." Verith had said, "I know that too. The research is excellent." Sarath had said after a pause, "That's not." "I know what you're asking," Verith had said. "You are asking whether I have decided what it means that your Kale is human." A pause of her own, deliberate. "The answer is that I am still determining it. The determination is going well." Sarath had looked at her for a long moment with the lens quality, the full attention. "All right," Sarath had said finally. "All right," Verith had said. She stood now at her window and watched the outer ring crew complete their loop, Sarath pausing at the scrubber ignition panel with the brief, expert touch of 11 years of practice, and then the soft blue light of ignition, and then, 15 seconds later, threading through the ventilation lattice from the outer ring inward, the faint acrid smell that was sulfur and hot copper, and the ordinary morning breath of a dome, where people lived and worked and wrote things down for whoever came after them. She breathed it in. Ilara Voss had written, "I hope you find this when you need it and not before." Verith thought about this sometimes, the specificity of that hope, not when you want it, when you need it. An engineer's distinction, precise and practical, because wanting and needing are different things, and in a crisis, you do not have the luxury of the former and must rely entirely on the latter. She had needed it. She had found it. 61 people had not come back, and she was going to spend years trying to understand why, and she was going to document every step of that effort with the precision she had learned from a woman she had never met, in a language she was still learning to read, for whoever came after. The morning noise of the dome was rising now. 411 people waking, beginning their work, producing the collective ambient hum of a place that was alive. She stood at her window for another 2 minutes, the last of her morning hour, and let the hum arrive. Then she turned from the window, picked up the day's first communication requests, and went to work.